I thought of the name Stomp, and I had this idea of a boot, hit in the ground with dust kicking up, and this feeling of rhythm and people and something. I didn't even know what it was, but I knew it was that thing. But before that, a lot of performance drum. I got into this idea of theatre and drumming through the street performance work, and was doing a lot of different things like duos, things outside of Poops and outside of not necessarily always with Steve either, but just experimenting and doing some stuff on my own, sometimes with the band with Poops and lots of things. And Steve was doing, and then we had a band at the same time, me and Steve doing this. So it was very much this whole thing moving around. And then eventually it was, sitting down with Steve and saying, looking back on stuff and saying, this would be great if we could just get the right people together to do this. This could be an amazing idea. That you put these things together, this jigsaw that didn't quite fit. And what Steve's great at doing is fitting the jigsaw together. I can throw all the pieces at him and bet someone's going to fit that together. And so that's really how it sort of came about. And some of the pieces within the show were things I'd done hanging off the pier in Brighton, doing suspension, doing a drum thing for something else, or stuff I did with Tin, and it's percussive things, and then stuff we did in Pookie's. We did a big bin routine. The original dustbin thing was done at the end of the street performance when we did a show in Edinburgh. But it was that sort of feeling of we'd also seen a show. There was two shows that we'd seen. One was a show called Moving Picture Mime, which is a phenomenal show, phenomenal company. They were way ahead of their time, and we were very envious about them because they seemed to travel all around the world with this show and with no dialogue. And they could get anywhere and do any gig and go anywhere they wanted. And so we quite liked the idea of putting something together that didn't involve acting or in a traditional sense, or words, or in that sense, and not music necessarily in that sense. So that was quite important. And the other thing we saw was the Burundi drummers, African drummers from Burundi at Covent Garden. And they were doing a big outdoor. They must have been promoting a show or something, but they did a pitch, and we were there watching them play. They're phenomenal. But when they ended, they picked up their drums and sort of put them over their backs and walked off. But they looked just like dustmen do in our country when they used to carry the bins on their backs. So there's a visual image there that was very striking. So there's a lot of different things. But like most things, you suddenly have that little moment where you go, oh, hang on a minute, everything I've been doing has been, we could put this together. It's all the odd things that don't make sense individually start to make sense collectively when you start to put it all together.
Very similar, really, to because we were already working together, and Luke had said to me, "Oh, I want to do a show called Stomp," and he just described a boot hitting the stage and dust flying in the air, and if I remember right, it was a guy sitting in a chair.
Yeah,
and he's going to stamp his foot.
The idea I thought was the audience would come in and there'd be this huge guy, skinhead, sort of sitting in his chair, just staring at the audience, and he'd just stare at them, making them uncomfortable until about, and then he'd just suddenly shout, "Stop!" And hit his foot on the floor, and the dust would come up, and the show would start. And that was the idea.
That was it, but there's no idea of what it was. And as Luke said, he'd been doing little things here and there. There was, in that period, because we had a band as well, another band, Yes No People, at the same time, and it was the time of the miners' strikes. It was the Margaret Thatcher period in British history, and so there are an awful lot of gigs that were fundraisers for to support the miners and things like that, and we'd be asked to do these things. Well, a lot of things were these events were arranged by Luke's brother Addison, who is an entrepreneur, and so Luke, or sometimes it'd be us, Luke and I, would do things. So in one event it would be a broom idea, and another event it would be an expansion of the bins idea. And it was kind of seeing the pieces of a jigsaw being scattered over time, and then sitting down and saying to Luke, I think Stomp is all these pieces put together.
The exciting thing about it for me was like, like brooms. I always said with brooms, it was like, I mean, I loved it. I mean, I'm funny because, like, I grew up loving, like I say, punk music, and I love jazz, and I love, I love the whole, from Gillespie to Coleman to all. So I just love music in all different forms, but I also love like Fred Astaire and the Nicholas Brothers and all that side of stuff. I'm not a big musical fan in the sense of musical shows, but I'm a big fan of tap and movement and I love live things like real skill, seeing someone really do it and play it and dance and sweat and believe it. I really love that. And so I always thought with brooms, it was like Fred Astaire would pick up a broom and dance with it for a moment and then throw the broom away and tap dance his way. And I was thinking, well, what if you just kept the broom? What would you do with the broom? And then what if there was more than one broom man? What if there was four people brooming? And what's their relationship? And how does that work? And that was that idea. And then it went from there. But what was nice about that is when you perform something like that, there's a connection to an audience because you're using a prop that everyone uses. It's a prop that everybody understands and everyone has at home. So it's not an alien thing. A drum kit is, we all know what a drum kit is, but it's alien to a lot of people because they've never sat behind a drum kit. But a broom is not alien to anyone. So you sort of started to realize that there was those sort of connections that really work as communicating the idea, make it less like a load of drummers having a jam, which is not what we wanted to do. I didn't want a big drum solo with loads of people. We wanted to, and that's what took us into so we're not dancers at all. I've never done dance in my life, but it took us into this idea of choreographing things, which I love, and I'm good at patterns and rhythms and memory in that sense. And so became very into that idea and really got into writing it and enjoying it and looking and searching for other things that have that connection with people and what are the props that can do that. And then you start to put those things together, as Steve says, and you start to think, well, what's the show about? Where's the show going? How does that work? And so it was a lovely organic ride, and it still is, to be quite frank.
I think the Luke mentioned moving picture mime, and they did a great show, one of the best shows I've ever seen. It was the uh, Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai as a mime piece, and it was just three guys, and it was absolutely phenomenal because you saw the movie. These three guys made you see it, and it was just incredible skill. They'd all come from the Lecoq School in Paris, and there's a very high skill factor there, and it was kind of unusual because most shows that were kind of on the fringe in the UK, if they weren't just a one-person show, they'd be kind of quite kind of ragged downbeat kind of production that didn't necessarily, it relied upon some kind of maybe emotional impact, but that would never really rely on a skill set particularly. It was almost like there wasn't a kind of a there's no kind of tradition of skill set that seemed to have gone. The kind of skills that you might have seen in vaudeville and that seemed to have disappeared. And I think what we realized with percussion and with Luke having this kind of rhythmic clockwork mind that could put all these pieces together, that if our people, if we got the right people and they worked and worked and worked at it, there would be a piece of theatre that had a really high skill factor to it, which would be really unusual. And at the time, I don't think it's quite so unusual now, but back then it was really unusual to go into a theatre and see something that's wow.
It's also I think one of the hardest challenges, which I think is one of the successes of Stomp, was not getting like 8 versions of me. And I don't mean that I mean 8 drummers, I mean 8 percussionists who can play and drum, and you have to get some. But it was also to get some people who weren't particularly good drummers, but were human and gave an element and a connection to an audience. And that was what we learned from being street performers, that nobody wants to see 8 people showing off. What they want to see is a journey of people growing and connection and how that works.
Yeah.
And so it was actually quite difficult to persuade some of the original Stomp performers to put up with the people who weren't as skillful as them, because they didn't understand why they had to put up with this. And we kept saying, because that's what makes it work. It's like people won't see your skill unless it's with some sense of normality that you can connect to from the audience. And I think that's really important, and it still is. I think it actually gets harder to do now because the people who come to want to do Stomp are so bloody talented that it's actually quite hard to not have sort of superhuman performers when you actually want it to feel like it's just normal people who are suddenly go on this journey, go on a ride. When we first put the stuff together, everything was about what could be dynamic, what can, you know, what can fill the room, how can we perform. And so we'd put these routines, we'd put brooms together, had bit dustbins together, we put poles together, and we had all this stuff. And you have to remember this was like 1990, and we all smoked like chimneys, and we rehearsed this routine. We'd rehearse these routines over and over again, stop, have a coffee, have a cigarette, do it again. And we never ever, you know, we weren't like theatre minded to do a dress rehearsal or anything. We just did this gig, and we nearly died because we nearly had heart attacks doing this show, because we'd do the first routine all out of breath, then had to do the next routine, then the next routine. Then by the time we'd done 5 routines, we were absolutely knackered. So we realized that we needed some light and shade within this show, and we needed some moments so we could actually catch our breath. And that was great, because that brought in subtlety to the show. It brought in, you know, that's why you try ideas out. You see straight away that, yeah, loud and brash and energy is wonderful, but if you don't have a bit of subtlety, if you don't have silence, then you don't have volume, you don't have anything else. So you learn those things. And so things like Matches was great because it just brought everything in. And then Zippos came about because we all had Zippos because we all smoked. And there was a great film called Diva, which a guy used to do a flip with a Zippo in. And so I got into learning all the tricks. And then it was about, well, if you do something, you can actually see the rhythm. You're not just, now you understand listening all the way through the show. You just stop for a moment, just watch it. And everyone follows it, and they've all got it. It's a bit like you've done a little crash course in rhythm, and now everyone just watches the rhythm fly. And that's a really nice moment in a show that just takes it in a different place. So yeah, it was just lots of different things that you can find.
So that's the reason I wasn't in the show. You know, up until that point, I'd always been a performer as well. And when we started Stomp, we knew we wanted to create a piece that would kind of fit within the world that Moving Picture Mime was in. And so to do that, I thought that one of us had to be outside of the show. And so that's why I was never in it, but Luke was always in it. And so he was kind of directing, creating from within. And I was from the outside saying, no, we need some light and shade.
But that was invaluable because you had vision from inside, and then you had vision from outside, and that makes a huge difference. You could actually, I mean, I could trust what was going on from his eyes, and he could trust what I was doing inside. And that, I think, without that, it wouldn't have worked.